"Do not embarrass your brother today, Morgan," my father whispered, his voice a harsh rasp cutting through the polite chatter of the Norfolk Military Assembly Room. His grip on my shoulder was rigid, the damp wool of his suit coat pressing cold against my bare neck. I smelled the sharp tang of rain and his heavy cologne as he leaned closer, making sure no one else heard the threat. I looked down at the cheap plastic name badge he had just shoved into my hand. It read, Miss Morgan Vance, family guest. There was no rank, no title. They had erased it completely. I did not argue. I pinned the plastic to my civilian blazer, the metal clasp biting into my cold fingertips. I am 39 years old, and I serve as an Army Lieutenant Colonel for the Joint Logistics Command. But to my father, William, I was still the broken piece of the Vance family legacy. "I am just here to sit in the back," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Make sure you do," he replied. He straightened his tie, his eyes fixed on the front of the room. Up on the brightly lit stage, my younger brother Brandon stood tall in his dress uniform. He was 37, the golden son, about to be promoted to Navy commander. Brandon caught my eye from across the crowded room. He did not wave. He just offered a slow, tight smirk, fully aware that I had been banished to the rear rows. Beside him, my mother, Margaret, smoothed her skirt. She glanced in my direction for a split second, her expression tight with guilt, before she quickly looked away. She had spent 12 years looking away. I took my seat at a small table near the heavy oak doors. A thick blue paper folder rested near the edge of the table. I glanced at the label printed on the front. It read, Gray Harbor Review. A tight knot formed in my throat. Operation Gray Harbor was the mission that ruined my standing in this family, the mission where I chose to save lives while Brandon froze in fear. Yet, here we were, celebrating him. The room quieted as the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. The sharp screech of audio feedback made me wince. "We are gathered today to honor the exceptional leadership and unwavering courage of a man who exemplifies the Navy finest," the speaker boomed. "A man whose decisive actions during Operation Gray Harbor saved countless lives." My hands curled into fists under the table. Those were my actions. He stood firm when the chain of command fractured. The speaker continued, reading directly from Brandon's official promotion packet. When the supply routes flooded, he assessed the risk, redirected the convoy, and ensured no one was left behind. I stopped breathing. I knew those words. I wrote those exact words 12 years ago in my original after-action report. Brandon had not just stolen the credit. He had stolen my actual sentences. My father applauded loudly from the front row. My mother kept her head bowed. Then, the heavy oak doors beside my table swung open. The damp wind from the Elizabeth River swept into the room, bringing the smell of salt and wet pavement. A 4-star Admiral walked in. The entire room scrambled to their feet. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I recognized Admiral Evelyn Hart immediately. She was the guest of honor, the official presiding over the Joint Command recognition. Brandon stepped forward on the stage, his chest puffed out, ready to receive the first handshake. My father beamed with pride. But Admiral Hart did not walk toward the stage. She ignored the aisle completely. Her heavy footsteps echoed on the wood as she turned and walked straight toward the back row. Toward me. She stopped in front of my table. I stood up on pure reflex, my posture snapping straight, and I offered a crisp, formal salute. Admiral Hart returned the salute perfectly, her face stern and commanding. Her voice carried across the dead silence of the hall. "Colonel Vance," the Admiral said, clear and sharp, "I was told you might be here." The silence in the room became absolute. Nobody moved. I saw the color completely drained from my father's face. His jaw dropped. On the stage, Brandon's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed stare. My mother finally looked up, her hands trembling in her lap. They thought I was just a family guest. They thought I was hiding in the shadows. Admiral Hart turned slowly, fixing her hard gaze on the stage. She looked right through my brother. "Commander-Select Vance," she projected, her tone cutting through the quiet room like a blade. "Why does your promotion packet contain language from a report written by your sister?" The silence following Admiral Hart's question hung in the air like heavy smoke. Everyone in the Norfolk Military Assembly Room stopped breathing. Brandon stood frozen on the brightly lit stage. For a single agonizing heartbeat, I watched my brother realize his entire golden career was crumbling under the weight of one sentence. To understand how our family reached this exact second, you have to go back 72 hours. 3 days before the ceremony, the autumn rain in Virginia had already started falling. Cold water hammered steadily against the thick glass of my apartment window. My living space remains meticulously clean, stripped of any unnecessary clutter, and completely devoid of family photographs. The only object sitting on my kitchen island was my mobile phone. The screen illuminated the dim room, vibrating aggressively against the smooth granite surface. A text message from my mother glowed in sharp, white letters. "Please come. I need you to see this with your own eyes." Margaret Vance never asked me for anything. For 12 years, she had communicated strictly through polite holiday greeting cards and brief nervous phone calls where she mostly talked about the weather or her garden. This sudden urgency felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I picked up the phone, tracing the smooth plastic edge of the case, wondering what exactly she wanted me to witness. Was it just another public celebration of Brandon and his flawless rise through the naval ranks? Walking into my bedroom, the quiet hum of the air conditioning wrapped around me. A closed mahogany box sat perfectly centered on my dark wooden dresser. Inside that box rested my medals, my official commendations, the physical proof of my service as an Army lieutenant colonel. I ran my fingertips across the polished wood of the lid, but I did not open it. Next to the dresser, a dark charcoal civilian suit hung freshly ironed on the closet door. I had already planned to attend the promotion ceremony as a ghost. My phone rang loudly, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the bedroom. The caller ID displayed my father name, William Vance. Pressing the green accept button, I answered with a simple, neutral greeting. "Morgan," his voice commanded through the small speaker. The tone was sharp, gravelly, and entirely devoid of any parental warmth. "I see you RSVP'd to the ceremony." "I did," I replied, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. "Listen to me carefully," my father said, his words measured and heavy with unspoken threats. "This is Brandon Day. He has worked incredibly hard for this promotion. Do not make it about you. Wear civilian clothes. Sit in the back row. Let him have his moment." He did not wait for a single word of response. The line clicked dead. A hollow dial tone buzzed in the empty apartment. Hearing his dictatorial voice immediately dragged me backward in time. Suddenly, I was no longer standing in my quiet, safe bedroom. I was sitting at the massive oak dining table in my parents' house 12 years ago, right after the disaster of Operation Gray Harbor. The memory tasted distinctly like cold roast beef and bitter red wine. That night, the dining room had felt exactly like a military tribunal. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture painfully rigid, his dark eyes burning with controlled fury. "Brandon has a massive future in Naval Command," my father had declared, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You went off script out there, Morgan. You broke the established chain of command. If the brass wants a scapegoat for the convoy confusion, you are going to take the hit." I saved human lives, I had argued, my hands trembling uncontrollably under the linen tablecloth. Brandon froze. The water was rising, and he flatly refused to give the order. My father slammed his open palm onto the polished wood. The expensive silver cutlery rattled violently against the porcelain plates. "Brandon needs a spotless record. You are strong enough to survive the shame." He is not. You will stay quiet, Morgan. For the survival of this family. I had looked across the table at Brandon. He stared down at his untouched food, completely refusing to meet my eyes. He let me take the heavy blame. He let our father paint me as the reckless rogue officer, while he effortlessly stepped into the spotlight as the steady, reliable leader. Standing in my apartment 3 days ago, the phantom echo of that slamming hand still made my jaw clench tightly. I reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the dark charcoal wool suit hanging on my closet door. Choosing this specific outfit was an active, conscious decision. I did not want to cause a public scene. I did not want to trigger another explosive family war. I was simply going to show up, fulfill my miserable obligation as the forgotten sister, and leave long before the reception started. Then my phone buzzed a third time. It was a new voicemail from my mother. I lifted the cold device to my ear, listening to the static. "Morgan," Margaret whispered. Her voice was shaking terribly, accompanied by the distinct dry sound of rustling paper in the background. I am standing in the attic of the old house. I found the blue storage box, the one William told me to throw away all those years ago. I kept it. I kept all of it. She paused to take a ragged, uneven breath. "I am sending it, Morgan," she continued, her voice gaining a tiny fraction of strength. "I cannot look away anymore. Just come to the ceremony, please." The audio message ended abruptly. I lowered the phone, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I did not know the full, devastating extent of what her words meant until today. But in that exact moment, while I stood alone in my apartment listening to the Virginia rain, Margaret Vance was making the very first brave decision of her entire life. I know now exactly how it happened. She was standing in the dusty, damp attic of my childhood home. Heavy rain beat down relentlessly on the shingled roof above her head. Her trembling hands were prying open a sealed cardboard box smelling of old paper and mildew. Inside that box lay the yellowed original pages of the after-action report from Operation Gray Harbor. The real unaltered report. The document that detailed exactly who planned the alternate rescue route and who bravely ordered the stranded convoy to move. My mother carefully smoothed out the deeply wrinkled pages. She placed them face down on the cold glass of her home scanner. The bright white light of the machine swept slowly across the paper, capturing every single word, every crucial timestamp, and every hidden truth. She attached those digital files to a blank email. The subject line she typed was incredibly simple, yet deeply dangerous. Operation Gray Harbor Correction. She pressed send. That small digital package flew through the encrypted military networks. It effortlessly bypassed my father and his massive web of local veteran influence. It completely bypassed Brandon and his carefully constructed golden reputation. The email landed directly in the secure inbox of the presiding officer for the Joint Command recognition. I can picture the fallout perfectly now. Inside a sterile, brightly lit office at the naval base, a young administrative aide clicked open a message flagged as a protected disclosure. The aide leaned closer to the computer monitor, reading the freshly scanned documents. They saw the original after-action report. They saw my specific name listed as the primary author. Following standard verification protocol, the aide then pulled up the official promotion packet recently submitted by Brandon Vance. The aide eyes must have widened in pure shock as they compared the two glowing screens. 4 separate, highly detailed paragraphs in Brandon's personal statement matched the original scanned report word for word. The only difference was that my name had been meticulously deleted and replaced with his. The aide immediately printed the damning pages, sliding them carefully into a thick blue paper folder boldly labeled Gray Harbor Review. They walked straight into Admiral Evelyn Hart' private office and placed the undeniable proof directly on her heavy mahogany desk. That specific blue folder was the exact same one I saw resting on the registration table today. Now, firmly back in the present moment, The cold rain continued to wash down the tall windows of the Norfolk Assembly Room. Admiral Hart stood tall at the back of the silent hall, her question still hanging over my brother like a sharpened executioner blade. "Why does your promotion packet contain language from a report written by your sister?" the Admiral repeated, her voice demanding an immediate public answer. Brandon gripped the sharp edges of the wooden podium on the stage. His knuckles turned completely white against the polished wood. He looked out frantically at the sea of formal dress uniforms in the audience, then locked eyes with our father sitting in the very front row. William was paralyzed in his padded chair, his authoritative mask entirely shattered into pieces. For 12 long years, they had completely controlled the family narrative. They had built a massive monument of pride directly on top of my forced silence. But my quiet, avoidant mother had finally handed over the heavy hammer needed to break it all down. The heavy rain pounding against the Norfolk Assembly Room windows sounded exactly like the violent storm from 12 years ago. Hearing Admiral Hart say the words Gray Harbor aloud stripped away the polished veneer of this ceremony. Suddenly, the sterile military hall faded. My senses plunged straight back into a miserable coastal hurricane. 12 years ago, I was 27 years old. Serving as an Army captain, my role focused heavily on joint logistics. Brandon was 25, acting as a junior Navy liaison officer. The raging coastal storm had completely shattered the local infrastructure, turning paved highways into deadly rivers. Our temporary command post smelled strongly of wet canvas, burning ozone from the overworked generators, and stale black coffee. Mud coated the floorboards. Pulling at my heavy combat boots with every step, Brandon stood near the front of the noisy tent. His uniform remained remarkably clean. Instead of hovering over the tactical maps, he spent his time trying to catch the attention of the senior commanders. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be recognized. Understanding the actual ground reality meant nothing to him. My attention remained locked on the main topographical map. A red grease pencil gripped tightly in my hand traced a dangerous situation developing on the eastern ridge. A massive medical convoy carrying wounded civilians was rapidly losing ground. Floodwaters were rising fast on their designated path. Doing the mental math, I realized they had exactly 10 minutes to divert onto an old elevated logging road. If they missed that narrow window, the freezing water would completely swallow their heavy transport vehicles. Time was evaporating. I walked sharply over to my brother. As the designated sector liaison, Brandon held the direct authority to authorize the emergency route change. I thrust the heavily marked map toward his chest. "The convoy is stuck," I told him, keeping my voice low but urgent over the roar of the generators. "They need to turn west immediately." Before he could even process the map, the main communications radio erupted with thick static. Sergeant Luis Ortega barked through the noise, his voice tight with genuine panic. Muddy water was already breaching the floorboards of their lead transport truck. Ortega demanded immediate navigational orders. My brother stared blankly at the radio console. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked desperately across the busy tent, hoping a senior officer would suddenly appear and take the terrifying responsibility off his shoulders. Nobody came. The commanders were busy managing 3 other collapsing sectors. "Give the order, Brandon," I urged him. He stepped backward. His polished boots slipped slightly in the mud. "We do not have official clearance for the logging road," he stammered. "If they get stuck up there, it falls on me. I cannot approve a blind deviation." "They are drowning right now," I pressed, pointing fiercely at the radio. "Authorize the turn." Brandon shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I cannot make that call." Those exact 6 words defined his entire character. When the polished system broke down, when real lives hung in the balance, my brother cared only about protecting his own pristine career. He chose obedience to a broken plan over human survival. A sharp crackle of static hissed from the speaker. Ortega was shouting now. Water was rising higher. Reaching past my frozen brother, I grabbed the heavy black microphone. My thumb pressed hard against the transmit button. "Then I will," I said into the receiver. I did not wait for permission. I read the new coordinates directly off my marked map, guiding Sergeant Ortega and his trapped convoy through the dark, twisting logging road. For 3 agonizing hours, I stayed on that radio, refusing to let them stop moving. They all survived. Every single person in those trucks lived because we broke the rules. The real tragedy did not happen during the storm. The tragedy arrived the very next morning wearing my father's face. William Vance walked into the chaotic command tent just as the sun broke through the heavy rain clouds. He did not hug me. He did not ask if I was injured or exhausted. He immediately pulled Brandon and me behind a tall stack of supply crates, far away from the listening ears of the other military officers. His dark eyes darted nervously around the busy room. "Did the communications officer log the route deviation?" William asked, his voice a harsh whisper. "Did anyone record who gave the actual order?" I was completely exhausted, my uniform soaked with cold mud and sweat. "I gave the order," I answered honestly. Brandon refused. My father's expression hardened into cold, unyielding stone. He looked at Brandon, taking in my brother's clean uniform and pale, terrified face. Then he looked at me. In that split second, William made a permanent, devastating calculation. "You broke the chain of command, Morgan," William stated coldly. "You went rogue. If the brass decides to investigate the confusion, this will destroy your brother. He has a pristine record. He has a massive future in the Navy." He panicked. I fired back, my voice rising. William grabbed my arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into my sore muscles. "You are strong enough to take a reprimand," he ordered. "Brandon is not. You will stay silent about the radio call. You will let this family manage the narrative." He chose his son. He looked at a daughter who had just saved dozens of lives and decided she was nothing more than a convenient human shield to protect his golden boy. They twisted my decisive action into a reckless mistake. They forced me to swallow the blame while they quietly built Brandon up as the steady, reliable officer who maintained his perfect composure during the chaos. Over the next 12 years, I accepted my role as the family failure. I moved on. I built a highly successful career in joint logistics, entirely independent of the Vance name. I assumed that terrible night was permanently buried. I assumed the original radio logs were lost forever in the massive bureaucracy of the military archives. I was wrong. The heavy memory of the storm slowly faded, replaced by the bright artificial lights of the Norfolk assembly room. The damp smell of the tent vanished, replaced by the scent of expensive perfume and polished wool. I was sitting at the back table. Admiral Evelyn Hart was standing right in front of me, but her piercing gaze was locked onto the stage. Up on the podium, Brandon was no longer smirking. His face matched the exact sickly gray color it had turned in the command tent 12 years ago. The entire room of distinguished guests sat in breathless silence, waiting for the golden sun to explain his fraudulent promotion packet. Brandon opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the Admiral, then down at our father in the front row. William was gripping the armrests of his chair, completely powerless to stop the incoming destruction. "Commander Select Vance," Admiral Hart prompted again, her voice echoing off the high acoustic ceilings. "I am waiting for an explanation." My brother swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously around the quiet hall, just like they did when Sergeant Ortega begged for help. Brandon was finally trapped, and this time, there was no powerful father to hide behind, and no silent sister to take the hit. Absolute silence possessed the Norfolk Military Assembly Room. Outside the tall windows, autumn rain continued to lash heavily against the thick glass, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown by the wind. Inside the hall, nobody dared to breathe. Hundreds of distinguished guests, dressed in pristine uniforms and expensive civilian suits, sat perfectly still in their padded chairs. The sudden shift in power felt tangible to my skin. It felt like a massive drop in barometric pressure right before a violent storm breaks open. Brandon stood completely frozen on the brightly lit stage. His hands gripped the wooden edges of the podium so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white against the dark mahogany. He stared down at Admiral Evelyn Hart, who remained planted at the back of the room near my small table. The 4-star Admiral did not blink. Her posture radiated pure, undisputed authority. She was waiting. Realizing the silence was slowly suffocating him, my brother tried desperately to recover his lost ground. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile onto his face, attempting to project the humble confidence that had defined his entire naval career. Adjusting the microphone slightly, he cleared his throat. The sound echoed harshly through the overhead speakers, grating against the quiet room. "Admiral Hart," Brandon began, his voice shaking slightly before he forcefully pushed it into a lower register. "There must be some sort of administrative misunderstanding regarding the paperwork. My sister and I served in the same sector during Operation Grey Harbor. We naturally share the same operational memories." He paused, leaning forward to inject a tone of fake sympathy into his words. Looking directly at me across the sea of heads, he played his absolute favorite card. "Morgan has always been rather sensitive about my career trajectory," he announced to the crowded room. "Ever since her unfortunate incident during that deployment, she struggles to separate her own experiences from the official record. I am sure she did not mean to cause a disruption today." Nausea twisted violently in my stomach. Even now, cornered by a commanding officer, Brandon instinctively weaponized the old family lie. He painted me as the bitter, jealous sister, desperately trying to steal his well-deserved spotlight. A low murmur rippled through the audience of naval officers and local veterans. Some people nodded slowly, whispering to their neighbors, readily buying into his polished performance. The golden sun was playing the victim. William shifted in his front row seat, letting out a heavy sigh of apparent parental exhaustion. My father was silently endorsing the narrative. They were doing it again. They were burying me in public to keep Brandon standing securely on his pedestal. My cold fingertips pressed hard against the cheap plastic name badge pinned to my blazer. Admiral Hart did not even flinch at the performance. She slowly raised her right hand. From the side aisle, a young aide dressed in a crisp uniform marched briskly forward. Their leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, measuring the tension in the room with every step. Reaching the stage, the aide placed a thick blue paper folder directly onto the wooden podium, right next to my brother's rigid hands. The bold printed label on the cover faced the audience. Grey Harbor Review. "This is not a tribunal, Commander-Select Vance," Admiral Hart projected. Her voice easily cut through the remaining whispers in the hall, chilling the air. "This is a mandatory procedural halt. A naval promotion relies entirely on the absolute integrity of official records. If a ceremony is gathered to honor a false record, the ceremony stops immediately." Brandon stared down at the blue folder like it was a live explosive device. A thin layer of sweat began to form on his forehead, catching the bright glare of the stage lights. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Open the packet," the Admiral ordered. Hesitating for a long, terrible second, my brother finally flipped the heavy blue cover open. The paper rustled loudly near the open microphone. The aide stepped up to the second microphone positioned on the stage, standing firmly beside my brother. "Page 12 of the personal statement," the aide instructed clearly, leaving no room for argument. Admiral Hart reached into her own uniform pocket and produced a folded piece of white paper. She opened it smoothly, keeping her eyes fixed on the man on the stage. "I will read from your submitted promotion packet, Mr. Vance," the Admiral declared. Quote, Assessing the catastrophic structural failure of the primary supply route, I initiated an immediate tactical diversion through the Eastern Logging Trail, overriding standard protocol to ensure civilian survival. End quote. Hearing those exact words spoken aloud made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up. I felt a sudden cold rush of adrenaline bloom inside my chest. Those were my specific words. I typed that very sentence on a clunky military laptop in a damp command tent 12 years ago. It was the core justification I wrote for my actions before my father forced me to bury the truth to save his son. Brandon wiped a drop of sweat from his brow. As I stated earlier, Admiral, we were both present in the sector. Military jargon often overlaps when describing the same tactical event. Military jargon overlaps. The aide on stage repeated flatly into the microphone. Digital footprints do not. The entire room seemed to lean forward collectively. The rustling of expensive suits and silk dresses stopped entirely. Even William froze in his chair. My office reviewed the network audit logs this morning, the aide explained to the audience, maintaining a perfectly neutral professional tone. Your personal statement was not drafted from memory. Every file in the military archives system carries a unique document control identification. The file submitted for your promotion panel contains the exact document control identification of an archived after-action report authored by Captain Morgan Vance 12 years ago. Brandon opened his mouth to argue, raising a shaking hand, but the aide spoke right over him. Furthermore, the aide continued relentlessly. The network archive logs confirm that a secure terminal assigned to your current naval office accessed that specific historical record exactly 3 weeks ago. You downloaded the original file, Commander Select Vance. You did not just remember the event. You used your sister official report as the primary source document for your own career advancement. A collective gasp echoed from the back rows of the room. The polished, flawless facade of the Golden Sun shattered into a million unfixable pieces right there on the stage. The irrefutable proof hung heavily in the damp air. It was no longer a matter of conflicting memories or bitter family drama. It was a documented, verifiable trail of digital theft. Seeing his grand legacy collapsing in real time, William could no longer stay seated. My father shot up from his padded chair. His face burned bright red with a mixture of fury and absolute panic. "Admiral Hart," William barked loudly, trying desperately to summon the old commanding presence he used to wield over his subordinates. "This is highly inappropriate for a public setting. Brandon is an exemplary officer with a spotless record. Whatever administrative errors occurred in his paperwork should be handled quietly in a private office. This is a private, family matter being dragged out to humiliate a good man." Keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap, I stared hard at the back of my father's head. He was still actively trying to protect the lie. He was still entirely willing to dismiss my stolen work as a simple administrative error just to save his precious son from facing any real consequences. Admiral Hart turned her freezing gaze away from the stage and focused entirely on the angry, red-faced man standing in the front row. The temperature in the room felt like it plummeted another 10 degrees. "Mr. Vance," the Admiral replied, her voice dangerously quiet but completely audible to every person in the hall. "When a commissioned officer submits a fraudulent document to a federal promotion board, it ceases to be a family matter. It becomes a matter of military integrity." William opened his mouth to argue, his jaw working furiously, but he could not find a single word to challenge a 4-star admiral on a matter of federal protocol. He stood there, trembling with rage, his fists clenched at his sides, completely stripped of his local power and influence. Slowly, humiliatingly, he sank back down into his chair. Margaret sat beside him, her small hands covering her mouth. My mother kept her eyes firmly locked on her lap, but for the first time in my entire life, she was not looking away out of fear of my father. She was looking away because she already knew exactly what was inside that blue folder. She was the one who sent it. Back on the stage, the young aide slid one final sheet of paper across the wooden podium toward Brandon. The thick paper settled right next to the open blue folder. Brandon looked down at the highlighted text. His shoulders slumped completely forward. The aggressive, confident posture he had carried for over a decade simply vanished, leaving behind a terrified small man who had finally run out of places to hide. Admiral Hart looked back up at the stage. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her pure authority commanded every single inch of the damp Norfolk hall. "Would you like to explain," Admiral Hart asked him, letting the words hang in the heavy air, "why your sister name was replaced with yours in 4 separate paragraphs?" Admiral Hart did not wait for my brother to formulate another desperate lie. The 4-star admiral raised her hand again, signaling a complete halt to the proceedings. "This promotion ceremony is officially placed on an administrative hold," Admiral Hart announced, her commanding voice echoing over the murmuring crowd. "All military personnel are ordered to remain in the building. Commander Select Vance, you will step down from the podium and accompany my aide to the holding room immediately." Brandon looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows. The aide stepped closer, gesturing firmly toward the side stairs of the brightly lit stage. My brother moved mechanically. His highly polished black shoes dragged heavily against the hardwood floor. Down in the front row, William surged to his feet again. "Brandon, do not say a single word without legal representation," my father barked, trying aggressively to push his way past the row of seated veterans. 2 naval security officers stepped smoothly into the center aisle, blocking William completely. My father's chest heaved with suppressed rage, but he could not physically push through uniformed security. The utter loss of control paralyzed him. The heavy oak doors of the assembly room suddenly felt too far away. The air inside the crowded hall had grown incredibly thin, saturated with the smell of nervous sweat and heavy men cologne. I needed to breathe real air. Rising from my chair in the back row, I slipped out through the side exit before anyone could turn their staring eyes toward me. The corridor outside was dimly lit and freezing cold. A long wall of tall windows looked out over the sprawling naval base. Dark gray clouds hung dangerously low over the Elizabeth River. Virginia autumn rain lashed aggressively against the thick glass, blurring the distant streetlights into streaks of pale yellow. I pressed my warm forehead against the freezing window pane, closing my eyes. My pulse pounded a frantic, uneven rhythm against my temples. Footsteps echoed softly on the polished linoleum floor behind me. The clicking sound was erratic, nervous, and entirely familiar. Turning around, I found Margaret Vance, standing 10 feet away. My mother clutched her small leather purse tightly against her chest like a protective shield. She wore a pale, gray silk dress that suddenly looked completely drained of life. The faint, familiar scent of her lavender perfume drifted down the hallway, mixing with the damp chill radiating from the wet windows. We did not move toward each other. There was no sudden maternal embrace. 12 years of enforced silence had built a massive, invisible wall of solid ice right down the middle of the corridor. "They stopped the ceremony," Margaret whispered. Her voice was raspy, trembling violently in the quiet space. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "They did." My mother swallowed hard. Her trembling fingers reached up to twist her gold wedding band, spinning it endlessly around her knuckle. It was a nervous, frantic habit she had carried my entire life, usually reserved for the terrifying moments right before William lost his temper. "The aide mentioned a protected disclosure," Margaret said, her eyes dropping to the polished floor. "They mentioned original documents. Someone sent my original report to the Admiral," I confirmed, watching her carefully. "Someone bypassed William entirely." Margaret stopped spinning her ring. She slowly lifted her head. Tears were silently spilling over her lower eyelids, tracking right through her carefully applied makeup. "I sent the email, Morgan," my mother confessed. 3 days ago, from the attic. The spoken words hit my chest like a physical blow. The breath vanished from my lungs. I stared at the small, fragile woman standing in the freezing corridor. Margaret had always been the designated peacekeeper, the silent shadow who smoothed over William's explosive demands. The idea of her actively dismantling her golden son career felt entirely impossible. "You," I breathed, taking a single step backward. "You gave them the digital footprint." Margaret nodded slowly, fresh tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "I kept the paper copy, Morgan. When your father ordered me to throw the blue box away, I took it up to the attic. I hid it behind the old winter coats. I thought maybe, someday, you would need the proof." Her tearful admission did not bring me any comfort. Instead, a deep burning anger began to claw its way up my throat. The cold rain outside seemed to pound even harder against the glass, amplifying the sudden chaos in my mind. "You had it," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You had the proof this entire time." "I was terrified," Margaret pleaded, taking a small, hesitant step forward. "Your father was so angry. He was completely obsessed with protecting the family name. If I had crossed him back then, he would have destroyed our entire lives." Looking at her tear-stained face, a sickening realization crashed over my mind. The fractured pieces of the past rearranged themselves into a horrifying new picture. 12 years ago, on the night William held his private tribunal in our dining room, the heavy wooden doors had been closed. My father had slammed his hand on the table, demanding I take the absolute blame for Brandon freezing under pressure. "Where were you that night?" I demanded, the burning anger finally leaking fully into my voice, "when William told me I was going to take the hit? Where exactly were you standing, Mother?" Margaret froze. Her hands tightened convulsively around her leather purse. The silence stretched out, filled only by the relentless drumming of the storm outside. "Answer me," I ordered, sounding much more like an army colonel than a daughter. "I was in the hallway," Margaret sobbed, covering her mouth with one shaking hand, right outside the dining room door. "I was bringing in the coffee service." The image slammed into my memory with perfect, violent clarity. I remembered hearing the faint rattle of porcelain cups right before my father began his cruel interrogation. I had thought it was just the old house settling in the heavy wind. I had thought we were completely alone in our miserable family war. "You heard him," I stated, the terrible truth tasting like copper on my tongue. "You stood right outside the solid oak door. You heard William tell me that my military career did not matter. You heard him say Brandon needed a spotless record because Brandon was the true legacy. You listened to him break me into pieces and you did absolutely nothing." Margaret let out a broken, ragged gasp. Her small frame shook violently against the backdrop of the stormy window. I could not turn the doorknob, Morgan. My hand was resting right on the cold brass, but I could not push it open. I was so incredibly scared of what would happen if I walked into that room and took your side. Your father controlled the bank accounts. He controlled the house. He controlled our entire social circle. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. She was weeping openly now, her shoulders shaking with 12 years of repressed, suffocating guilt. The expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She wanted absolution. She wanted me to cross the cold physical distance between us, wrap my arms around her trembling shoulders, and tell her that everything was finally forgiven because she eventually found a small shred of courage. I remained firmly planted in my spot. The chill from the window seeped deeply into my bones, freezing any remaining sympathy I might have held for her. "Crying does not change history," I told her, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You let him bury me." Margaret wiped her face frantically with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. She reached into her leather purse with trembling fingers. Pulling out a crumpled, yellowed envelope, she held it out toward me like a desperate offering of peace. I brought the rest of the files. my mother said, her voice catching painfully in her throat. The scanner was old. I could not send all the pages through the email, but I brought the physical copies today. I stared at the old paper. I did not want to touch anything belonging to that house, but the absolute need to see the complete truth overpowered my disgust. Stepping forward, I snatched the envelope from her shaking hand. The paper felt dry and brittle, smelling strongly of dust and enclosed spaces. Flipping the top flap open, I pulled out 2 folded documents. The first was a printed email. The header showed a date from 12 years ago. The sender was William Vance. The recipient was Brandon Vance. I did not read the body text yet. The mere existence of a written conspiracy between them made my stomach churn. The second document was printed on official military letterhead. It was a draft. A formal commendation recommendation authored by my former commanding officer, Major General Thomas. My eyes scanned the faded, typewritten words. The Major General had written a glowing review of my decisive actions during Operation Grey Harbor. He praised my rapid, tactical calculation. He explicitly recommended me for a meritorious service medal. This paper had never reached my official military file. William had used his extensive connections within the veteran community to quietly kill the recommendation before it could ever be officially processed. My father had stolen my honor just to ensure his son looked taller. I looked back up at Margaret. She was watching my face, desperately hoping this piece of paper would bridge the massive gap between us. "You saved the papers," I said, my voice completely hollow. "You saved the files, you saved the emails, but you did not save me, Mother." Margaret flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. "Morgan, please. I am trying to fix it now. I am trying to give you your name back." "My name was never yours to give back," I replied coldly. "You chose your husband and your golden son 12 years ago. You do not get to play the hero today just because your guilt finally became too heavy to carry." Folding the brittle papers carefully, I slid them into the inside pocket of my civilian blazer. The physical weight of the envelope rested directly over my heart. I turned my back on my weeping mother, facing the heavy oak doors that led back into the assembly hall. The truth was no longer hiding in a dusty attic. It was in my pocket. Before pushing the heavy door open, my brain processed a specific phrase printed on the drafted commendation. The words replayed loudly in my mind. The Major General had written about my unique ability to assess catastrophic structural failure and initiate an immediate tactical diversion. My hand froze completely on the cold brass door handle. The air suddenly left my lungs. That was the exact phrase Admiral Hart had just read aloud from the stage. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Brandon had not only stolen my after-action report, my brother had actually gained access to the buried commendation meant for my chest and shamelessly pasted those exact glorious words into his own personal statement for a naval promotion. The absolute arrogant cruelty of his digital theft was completely staggering. My brother thought he was entirely untouchable. He thought he could wear my stolen honor like a tailored suit. Pushing the heavy brass door open, I stepped back into the suffocating atmosphere of the assembly hall. The ambient noise had shifted from stunned silence to a low, aggressive murmur. Hundreds of military officers and civilian guests whispered frantically among themselves. Pushing past a group of junior lieutenants, I returned to my small table near the rear exit. My hand instinctively pressed against my blazer pocket, feeling the stiff outline of the concealed envelope my mother had just given me. Up on the stage, the situation had deteriorated further for my brother. Brandon was no longer standing behind the wooden podium. Naval security personnel had directed him to a lower set of chairs, positioned to the far left of the platform. His pristine white dress uniform suddenly looked entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He stared at his highly polished shoes, completely unable to meet the burning gaze of our father in the front row. William was sitting rigidly upright, his jaw clenched so tightly that a visible muscle ticked violently near his ear. Admiral Evelyn Hart remained firmly planted at the center microphone. She did not look flustered. She looked like a seasoned commander managing a highly volatile battlefield. Her young aide marched briskly up the side steps of the stage, carrying a sleek, black digital tablet. The aide leaned close to the Admiral, whispering a rapid stream of information. Admiral Hart nodded slowly, her expression tightening into a mask of pure focused intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Hart announced, her voice instantly silencing the buzzing crowd, "my office has just received an urgent communication directly related to the documents under review. When a protected disclosure involves a historical joint command operation, we are obligated to verify all surviving witness accounts. A civilian survivor from Operation Gray Harbor was contacted this morning regarding the discrepancies in the official record. He has provided a verified video statement." A large auxiliary viewing screen descended slowly from the ceiling behind the main podium. The mechanical whir of the motor sounded excessively loud in the quiet room. A projector clicked on, casting a bright, rectangular beam of light through the dim air. The screen flickered to life. The image displayed a brightly lit suburban living room. A man sat on a modest fabric sofa, wearing a simple blue button-down shirt. He appeared to be in his late 40s. Deep lines of exhaustion and hard work framed his dark eyes, but his posture was remarkably straight. A framed photograph of a young, smiling girl rested on the wooden side table next to him. I recognized his face instantly, even after 12 long years. The last time I saw him, his face was coated in thick black mud, and his left arm was bleeding heavily into a dark green canvas stretcher. "My name is Luis Ortega," the man on the screen said. His voice was deep, carrying a slight nervous tremor, but ringing with absolute sincerity. 12 years ago, I was driving the 3rd transport truck in the Eastern Medical Convoy during the Gray Harbor storm. A heavy knot formed instantly in my throat. Hearing his voice again dragged me straight back into the freezing floodwaters. "We were completely trapped," Luis continued, leaning slightly closer to his recording camera. "The main highway washed out in front of us. The water rose so fast it flooded our engine blocks. It was pitch black, freezing cold, and the radio was filled with people screaming for help. We honestly thought we were going to drown in those trucks." From his isolated chair on the side of the stage, Brandon suddenly shot to his feet. "Admiral," Brandon interrupted loudly, desperation cracking his polished naval tone. "With all due respect, this is highly irregular. Witness memory following a severe traumatic event is notoriously unreliable. The intense stress of a hurricane heavily distorts temporal perception. You cannot use a civilian emotional recollection to challenge an official military document." Admiral Hart turned her head slowly, fixing Brandon with a stare so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," she commanded softly. The absolute authority in her tone offered zero room for debate. "You will not interrupt this witness again." Brandon swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, humiliating shade of red. He sank slowly back into his chair, looking exactly like a scolded child in front of hundreds of his peers. The aide tapped the digital tablet, resuming the video playback. "We begged the sector command for an alternate route," Luis Ortega explained to the silent hall. "The liaison officer on the main frequency kept telling us to hold our position." He sounded completely terrified. He kept saying he could not make the call. The water was waist deep inside my cab when a new voice finally came over the radio. Luis paused, taking a slow, ragged breath. His dark eyes stared directly into the camera lens, seeming to look right through the digital screen and into my soul. "It was a woman," Luis said, his voice thickening with suppressed emotion. "She did not ask for permission. She just took control. She gave us the logging trail coordinates, and she stayed on that radio with us for 3 terrifying hours. When we finally reached the high ground, the military medical teams rushed in. That same female officer found me sitting in the mud. I had a deep gash on my forearm from a shattered windshield. She did not have any medical supplies left, so she tied her own personal handkerchief around my bleeding arm to stop the bleeding. Luis reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small square of faded white cotton fabric. He held it up to the camera. The edges were deeply stained with old rust-colored marks. In the bottom corner, 2 small initials were neatly embroidered in dark blue thread. Mena. My breath caught painfully in my chest. I remembered that exact handkerchief. I remembered wrapping it tightly around his shaking arm while the rain beat down on our helmets. I had completely forgotten about that tiny piece of fabric, but he had kept it safe for over a decade. I never forgot her voice, and I never forgot her initials, Luis stated firmly. Captain Morgan Vance saved our lives that night. The entire assembly room collectively shifted their gaze toward the back corner where I stood. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto my plain civilian suit. I kept my chin raised, refusing to shrink under the massive weight of their sudden attention. William shifted violently in his front row seat. His face was entirely pale now, completely drained of the furious red color from earlier. He looked genuinely terrified. A few months after the storm, Luis continued on the screen, his expression hardening into quiet anger. I tried to find her. I wrote a long letter of gratitude. I wanted my family to know exactly who gave me the chance to come home to them. I mailed it to her permanent home address, listed in the public veteran directory. Luis set the stained handkerchief down and picked up a standard white envelope. He held it close to the camera lens. Across the front of the envelope, thick, aggressive black marker slashed through his return address. A handwritten note was scrawled aggressively across the paper. The letter came back to me unopened 2 weeks later, Luis explained, reading the heavy black ink aloud. Do not contact this family again. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. The physical envelope hidden inside my blazer pocket suddenly felt like a burning coal against my skin. I stared at the giant projection screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my father's cruelty. William had not merely forced me to take the professional blame. He had actively intercepted a beautiful letter of human gratitude just to ensure I remained entirely isolated in my false disgrace. He had methodically starved me of any validation so his golden sun could continue to shine without any inconvenient shadows. A low, unified rumble of pure disgust rippled through the audience. Several senior veterans sitting near William actively leaned their bodies away from him, completely severing their unspoken alliance. My father stared straight ahead, entirely unable to look back at me. I want to make one thing perfectly clear, Luis said, leaning back into his sofa. I am just a civilian driver. I do not possess any classified military documents. I do not have a secret recording of that night. I know the rules. Brandon visibly relaxed in his chair on the stage. A tiny, sickening glimmer of hope flickered across my brother's face. If the civilian had no hard evidence, Brandon could still try to twist the narrative back to a tragic case of mistaken memory. But Luis Ortega was not finished. I never had the radio logs, Luis stated. But while I was recovering in the military hospital, I became good friends with the communications officer from that sector tent. Her name is Maya Chen. She told me she logged every single word spoken on that emergency frequency. The glimmer of hope on Brandon's face vanished instantly, completely replaced by stark, naked terror. Maya left the service years ago, Luis explained to the silent room. But she told me to memorize a specific set of numbers just in case the truth ever mattered. She said the original audio log was permanently transferred into the Joint Communications Archive. She gave me the exact archive reference code. Luis held up a small yellow sticky note. He read a long string of letters and numbers aloud, his voice steady and perfectly clear. That is where you will find Captain Vance giving the order, Luis concluded. That is where you will hear the truth. Thank you for your time. The screen clicked off, rolling smoothly back into the ceiling. The heavy silence returning to the room felt entirely different this time. It was no longer a silence of confusion or suspense. It was the heavy, crushing silence of inevitable doom. Brandon gripped his knees, rocking slightly in his chair. He was trapped. There was no clever lie or administrative excuse that could possibly erase a permanent audio file sitting deep within a federal military archive. Admiral Hart turned away from the blank wall. She looked directly at her young aide standing beside the podium. The aide stepped forward, closing the black digital tablet with a sharp, authoritative snap. The young officer leaned close to the center microphone, ensuring every single person in the massive hall heard the final, devastating update. "Ma'am," the aide reported, their voice echoing loudly over the quiet crowd. "The Communications Archive team confirmed the Gray Harbor extract exactly 4 minutes ago, using that specific reference code. We have the line." The young aide words hung heavily in the chilled air of the Norfolk Assembly Hall. "We have the line." Those 4 words acted like a heavy iron vault slamming shut, permanently sealing my brother inside his own massive lie. Admiral Evelyn Hart nodded slowly, her expression remaining perfectly unreadable. She turned her attention toward the audiovisual technician sitting behind a large mixing board in the far corner of the room. "Connect the archive feed directly into the primary overhead speakers," the Admiral instructed quietly. Her tone carried zero theatricality. She was simply executing federal procedure. Sitting isolated on the side of the fully illuminated stage, Brandon looked as if all the blood had been forcefully drained from his body. His hands gripped the fabric of his white dress trousers, twisting the pristine wool into wrinkled knots. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for another administrative excuse, but his throat seemed completely paralyzed. The young aide stepped back up to the center microphone to establish the formal parameters of the evidence. "For the official record," the aide announced, ensuring the massive crowd understood the gravity of the source. "This audio file is a direct, unedited extraction from the Federal Joint Communications Archive. Former Communications Officer Maya Chen provided the secure reference code to the civilian witness. Our archive control team immediately verified the chain of custody. This digital file has remained entirely sealed and untouched for 12 years." No one in the audience moved. Hundreds of highly decorated military professionals sat perfectly rigid, their eyes locked intensely on the empty wooden podium. The technician pressed a glowing red button on the mixing board. A sharp electronic pop snapped through the quiet room. Immediately following the pop, a massive wave of chaotic noise washed over the silent crowd. It was not a clear studio recording. It was the raw, violent sound of a catastrophic coastal hurricane. The heavy overhead speakers hissed with thick noises, aggressively layered over the relentless, deafening roar of torrential rain and howling wind. Sitting inside the pristine, climate-controlled hall in Virginia, everyone suddenly felt the freezing dampness of Operation Gray Harbor. The ambient noise alone conveyed absolute terror. Through that chaotic storm, a voice finally broke over the frequency. It sounded incredibly young, tight, and entirely consumed by blind panic. "Sector Command, this is Liaison Actual," the voice stammered through the heavy static. "We cannot authorize the route deviation. Repeat, we do not have authorization for the logging trail." A collective, uneasy murmur rippled through the front rows of the audience. Every single naval officer in the room instantly recognized the speaker. It was Brandon. However, this version of his voice lacked all the polished baritone confidence he had spent the last decade perfecting. This voice belonged to a terrified junior officer completely overwhelmed by a collapsing tactical situation. Another voice crackled through the speakers, shouting desperately over the sound of rushing water. It was Sergeant Luis Ortega. "We are drowning out here," Ortega screamed into his radio. "The floodwater is breaching the engine blocks. We need those logging trail coordinates right now, or this entire convoy is going under." On the official recording, a long, agonizing pause followed. The storm raged violently in the background, filling the assembly hall with the sound of incoming death. "Give the order," a female voice demanded in the background of the audio track. Hearing my own voice, 12 years younger and vibrating with raw urgency, sent a strange electric shock down my spine. The memory was no longer trapped inside my head. It belonged to the room now. "I cannot," Brandon whimpered on the tape, his voice cracking horribly. "They are drowning right now." My recorded voice pressed harder. "Authorize the turn." "I do not have higher clearance," Brandon shot back, his panic escalating into genuine hysteria. "If they get stuck on that eastern ridge, the failure falls entirely on me. I cannot make that call." Those 6 specific words echoed off the high acoustic ceiling tiles, hanging in the damp air like a heavy death sentence. Every single veteran and active duty officer in the room stared directly at the man sitting on the stage. They heard exactly what happened when the celebrated Golden Son faced a genuine life-or-death crisis. Brandon shrank. He actively prioritized his own pristine administrative record over the lives of trapped, bleeding civilians. He had allowed his own men to face drowning simply because he was afraid of receiving a reprimand for breaking protocol. Then, the archive audio feed crackled one final time. "Then I will," my recorded voice stated with absolute chilling calm. The recording clicked off. The sudden silence returning to the assembly room felt deafening, heavier than concrete. The violent storm was gone, leaving only the devastating public wreckage of a stolen legacy. Nobody looked at Brandon with admiration anymore. The distinguished guests viewed him through a new hardened lens. They saw a coward who had stolen the valor of the very sister he had spent years painting as unstable and jealous. Realizing he was completely exposed, a sudden ugly wave of desperate aggression overtook my brother. The terrified junior officer vanished, replaced by a cornered animal willing to bite anything to survive. Brandon shot up from his chair, pointing a shaking finger directly toward the back of the hall where I stood. "She broke the chain of command," Brandon shouted, his voice echoing shrilly across the room. "You all heard the tape." Morgan went completely rogue. "She initiated an unauthorized deviation without proper clearance. That is textbook insubordination. Our family had to step in and contain the massive damage she caused. We had to protect the integrity of the sector." He was actually trying to spin it. Even with his own cowardice played aloud for a room full of federal officers, Brandon instinctively fell back onto the exact same twisted logic our father had created 12 years ago. He genuinely believed that blind obedience to a broken rule was far superior to saving human lives. Down in the front row, William nodded sharply, his eyes darting around the room to see if the crowd was buying the excuse. My father desperately wanted the audience to focus on my technical rule-breaking rather than his son's moral failure. I refused to let them control the narrative for another second. Stepping away from the small table near the heavy oak doors, I walked slowly down the center aisle. My leather shoes clicked deliberately against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted slightly, turning their bodies to watch me approach. I did not wear a dress uniform covered in shiny metals. I wore a simple dark charcoal suit. I did not need the fabric of the military to validate my authority today. Stopping halfway down the main aisle, I looked directly up at the stage. I did not shout. I did not let a single drop of anger bleed into my tone. I projected my voice from my chest, ensuring every word carried absolute clarity. "I did not break the chain of command to steal credit," I stated, staring right into my brother's panicked eyes. "I broke silence because people were dying." The words struck the room with the force of a physical blow. Several senior naval commanders sitting near the aisle slowly nodded their heads in quiet agreement. In the military, protocol is strictly enforced, but true leadership demands taking immense personal risk to protect human life. Brandon had utterly failed that fundamental test, and I had passed it. "You stole my report because you knew my tactical decision was the only reason those people survived," I continued, my voice remaining perfectly steady. You wore my commendation words today because you desperately wished you had possessed the courage to say them 12 years ago. Brandon opened his mouth, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred, but he had absolutely no ammunition left. The digital footprint, the witness statement, and the official archive audio had completely disarmed him. He stood on the stage, entirely stripped of his unearned glory, looking incredibly small and pathetic. Seeing his ultimate creation fully dismantled, William could no longer endure the humiliation. My father leaped from his padded chair in the front row. He slammed his heavy fist violently against the wooden armrest. "Enough!" William roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This entire display is a complete disgrace. You are ruining your brother's special day, Morgan. You are embarrassing this entire family in front of our community. I will not sit here and allow you to destroy his career over ancient history." William glared at Admiral Hart, attempting to use his sheer physical presence to intimidate her into shutting down the proceedings. He still believed he was the most powerful man in the room. He still believed his aggressive patriarchal authority could overwrite federal military protocol. Admiral Evelyn Hart slowly turned her attention away from the broken man on the stage. She focused her freezing, commanding gaze entirely on the furious man standing in the front row. She did not flinch at his shouting. "No, Mr. Vance," Admiral Hart replied smoothly, her tone carrying the terrifying weight of a fully loaded weapon. "The discussion regarding your son is officially concluded. Now, we discuss your role." Richard stiffened, his face draining of all color, as the accusation landed with the finality of a gavel. The billionaire, Martin Hale, did not look away, his icy stare pinning my father to the spot. Brittany stood motionless, her hands hovering helplessly near the delicate silk of her skirt, clearly realizing that the carefully constructed narrative of a struggling family charity had finally shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I did not let the momentum die. Reaching into the manila envelope, my fingers brushed the edge of the financial records Elena had provided. It was time to pull back the curtain on the entire charade. "Richard, if the foundation is truly insolvent, perhaps you could explain these accounting entries," I said, maintaining a level, professional tone that echoed across the lawn. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I stepped forward, holding the ledger out toward the crowd. The foundation took in $420,000 in donations during the previous year. That is a significant sum for a local organization. Yet, when I look at the internal ledgers, I see exactly how that money evaporated. I pointed to the lines detailing the wedding preparations. $118,700, I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving. That amount was systematically funneled away from the veteran support accounts. It was deliberately misclassified under vague labels like Veteran Family Outreach and Donor Hospitality. Nolan walked over to my side, his eyes scanning the columns. He gestured toward the tent. "The vendor invoices for this venue are listed in the Foundation Master Ledger as outreach expenses," Nolan stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "The floral installation, the media production, and the rehearsal dinner were all funded directly by money intended for families who lost everything." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the garden. The guests looked at the towering floral arrangements, seeing them for exactly what they were, stolen property. The extravagance that had seemed so beautiful only an hour ago now looked grotesque. Richard attempted to speak, his hands waving in a desperate, frantic gesture. "We have operating costs," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit gates. "We need to maintain a professional appearance to continue attracting large donors. You cannot expect us to function without the proper tools to showcase our reach." Martin Hale let out a sharp, cynical laugh that carried no humor. "You showcase your reach by starving, grieving widows," Hale remarked, his gaze piercing. "I donated my money to support the families behind the uniform. I did not realize I was actually subsidizing a private family celebration." Brittany shrieked in protest, but the sound was drowned out by the audible rustling of guests checking their phones. The damage was spreading faster than any PR team could hope to contain. I pulled one final document from the envelope. This was the invoice for the bridal media package, the set of professional photographs designed to project an image of philanthropic perfection. At the bottom, the handwritten note was still visible, clearly showing the directive to charge the charity account. "Brittany," I said, looking directly at my sister, whose face had twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You did not just benefit from this fraud. You requested the charges yourself. You told the vendors to pull directly from the charity account because you wanted the perfect photos to sell the fake image of a selfless military bride." Brittany took a stumbling step toward me, her eyes flashing with a desperate, venomous light. "You have no right to do this," she hissed, ignoring the cameras and the donors. "I worked for years to build this image. I spent months curating every single detail. You just walked in here with a handful of stolen papers and decided to tear everything down. You are so incredibly jealous that you could not stand to see me succeed at something you never even tried to build." Her words hung in the air, a pathetic testament to her complete detachment from reality. She truly believed her own lies, convinced that her social status justified the theft. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a calm, professional register. "You did not build anything," I stated, looking her dead in the eyes. "You just decorated a grave." Behind us, Denise, the aunt who had served as the foundation communications director, suddenly collapsed onto a lawn chair. Her face turned an alarming shade of gray, her breathing coming in jagged, shallow gasps. She clutched the papers Denise had been holding, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the true legal implications of the forged signatures and the misclassified invoices. "I did not know the ledger was falsified," Denise whispered, her voice barely audible. "Richard told me the foundation board had authorized the expenses. He told me the charity had a surplus." My father turned on Denise with a snarl, but it was far too late for blame shifting. The damage to his credibility was absolute. Every single donor within earshot was already moving away from the reception area, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to active, boiling anger. Martin Hale pulled his cell phone from his tailored pocket. He stepped away from the group, his thumb flying across the glass screen. "I am notifying my donor-advised fund," Hale announced, his voice booming across the garden. "I am requesting an immediate hold on the pending $50,000 transfer. I am also calling for a full, third-party forensic audit of the Holloway Fund. If I find that my money was used for personal gain, I will see to it that the foundation is completely dismantled." Several other donors followed his example. The air in the tent became frantic as multiple people began making calls, canceling pledges, and demanding official financial disclosures. The wedding was over. The charade had collapsed, leaving only a group of people facing the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. I looked down at the documents, then up at the empty, silent altar. My father and sister stood alone in the center of the lawn, surrounded by the remnants of an event that would now serve as evidence in their eventual trial. The transformation from a wealthy, admired family to a group of desperate individuals facing federal investigation was complete. Nolan stayed by my side, his presence a silent validation of everything I had just revealed. He did not look at Brittany once. His entire focus remained on the victims, ensuring that Sarah Whitmore remained protected and that the donors understood the truth. My sister stood trembling, her eyes searching for any remaining shred of her audience, but the garden had turned cold and dismissive. The beautiful illusion was dead, and the reality of their choices was just beginning to settle into the soil. Richard looked at me with a desperate, hollow intensity. "You will regret this," he muttered, his voice shaking with a pathetic, powerless rage. "You destroyed your own blood for a few pieces of paper." I folded the final document, sliding it neatly back into the manila envelope. The weight of the records felt incredibly light. "No," I stated, meeting his gaze without a single hint of hesitation. "I finally stopped you from destroying other people's blood." The cold air of the Norfolk afternoon felt sharper than any knife. Stepping out of the assembly hall, the rain had thinned into a fine, misty spray that coated the concrete walkways in a slick, dark sheen. I stood on the base steps for a moment, simply inhaling the scent of wet pavement and salt air, feeling the profound stillness that follows a massive structural collapse. The heavy oak doors behind me remained shut, muffling the chaotic, panicked whispers of the people still trapped inside that ruined ceremony. My brother's future lay in ruins on that stage, and my father's authority had finally been reduced to a pathetic, shivering memory. I did not feel an overwhelming surge of joy. Instead, a quiet, steady peace settled deep into my bones. I began walking toward the main parking area, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the wet ground. The vast naval complex seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire base had collectively held its breath during the confrontation. Halfway to my car, the sound of hurried, uneven footsteps echoed against the stone walls behind me. "Morgan, wait," Brandon called out. His voice lacked the arrogance that had defined his public persona for over a decade. It sounded hollow, stripped of all its practiced naval charm. I did not stop walking. I did not want to look at him, but he caught up quickly, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He was not wearing his service cap, and his white jacket looked strangely disheveled, as if he had been physically dragged through the mud. He positioned himself directly in my path, forcing me to stop. The sight of him, so terrified and genuinely lost, should have sparked some form of long-forgotten sympathy. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. He was a complete stranger to me, a man whose entire life had been constructed on the stolen wreckage of my own accomplishments. "Tell me this is a mistake," Brandon pleaded, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Tell me you will call the Admiral and say it was all some massive clerical misunderstanding. We can fix this, Morgan. We can explain it away. Dad has contacts at the Pentagon. He can talk to the review board before the formal investigation gets too deep." I looked at him, really looked at him, and recognized the absolute void where his integrity should have been. He still did not understand. He genuinely believed that the world was just a series of powerful favors and manipulated narratives. "There is nothing to fix, Brandon," I said, keeping my voice steady and cold. "You stole a report. You lied to a promotion board. You betrayed the people you were supposed to command. That is not a clerical error. That is a permanent failure of your character." "I did what I had to do for the family," he shouted, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate mask of rage. "You never understood the pressure. You were always the golden child in the eyes of our instructors, and I was just the younger brother trying to keep pace. I had to ensure the legacy survived." "You did not survive for the legacy," I corrected him, stepping into his personal space. "You survived by parasitizing the people around you. You are not a leader, Brandon. You never were." The archive audio proved that to everyone in that room today. He flinched as if I had struck him, his bravado finally fracturing completely. He looked behind him, toward the building where our father was likely being escorted toward his own public ruin. "How am I supposed to go home to him now?" Brandon whispered, his voice cracking into a jagged sob. "He will never look at me again if I am not an officer. He will act like I do not exist." "Then you are finally going to experience what it feels like to be a Vance daughter," I replied, turning my back on him. I left him standing alone in the rain, a man stripped of his identity and his unearned future. I did not look back to see if he watched me go. Reaching my car, I sat in the driver's seat and stared through the windshield at the gray, churning water of the Elizabeth River. My hands rested on the steering wheel, finally perfectly steady. A few minutes later, I saw Margaret emerge from the assembly building. She walked slowly, her shoulders hunched against the biting wind. She stopped when she reached the walkway where Brandon stood, but she did not approach him. She simply kept walking, heading toward her own car. She was finally choosing to walk away from the wreckage she had helped build. I started the engine, the low hum of the vehicle vibrating through the frame. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw a member of the local Veteran Community Council approach the building entrance. He stopped and shook his head, looking directly at the entrance where William had been the day's featured speaker. I knew the look on his face. It was the look of a man who had finally realized exactly what kind of person he had been inviting to his events for the last 10 years. I turned onto the main road, the gray horizon of Norfolk stretching out before me. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, but I did not reach for it. I did not need to see the fallout. The news of a prominent veteran leader and his son being publicly humiliated would spread through the community by nightfall. The investigation would move forward with brutal efficiency, and the corrected record would eventually arrive in my mailbox. I reached into my blazer pocket and touched the envelope my mother had given me. Those brittle papers were no longer my burden. They were proof of a story that finally reached its proper conclusion. I had walked into that assembly room as a family guest, a silent figure meant to be hidden in the shadows of a golden legacy. I drove out of the naval base as a lieutenant colonel, whose name was finally written correctly on the official record. I felt the engine pull forward, heading away from the cold, damp memories of the past and into the quiet, steady air of my own life. I did not need a medal to know that I had survived. I simply needed the truth to do its work. The drive back to my quiet apartment felt like a slow transition between two different lifetimes. Norfolk faded into the distance, the gray afternoon sky finally beginning to lighten as I moved further away from the naval base. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat, though I knew the digital world was currently consuming every detail of the ceremony. The Vance legacy was not just being dismantled, it was being erased in real time, and for the first time, I felt no compulsion to track the debris. When I finally pulled into my assigned parking spot, the evening air had turned crisp and clear. I walked up to my unit, the keys feeling heavy and solid in my palm. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, orderly, serene, and blissfully empty of family expectations. I hung my blazer in the hallway closet, the envelope from my mother still resting securely in the inside pocket. I did not take the papers out to read them again. They had served their purpose. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of cool water, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator. The silence of the room was not the oppressive, heavy silence of my parents' house. It was the peaceful silence of a life I had earned for myself. 2 weeks passed before the final official envelope arrived. It came via certified federal mail, the heavy, cream-colored paper feeling substantial and authoritative in my hands. Inside lay the final report from the Department of Defense Investigative Division regarding the fraudulent promotion packet submitted by Brandon Vance. It confirmed the total rejection of his application, his indefinite reassignment away from any command duties, and the formal start of a military disciplinary proceeding. There was a second document included in the package. It was a formal notification from the Personnel Office confirming the correction of my official military service records. My name was listed exactly where it belonged, attached to the tactical decisions of Operation Gray Harbor. I stared at the crisp black ink, the letters forming my title, Lieutenant Colonel Morgan Vance. I did not feel the need to frame it. I did not need to hang it on my wall to prove anything to anyone. I simply walked over to the mahogany box on my dresser and placed the document inside alongside my other service records. The cycle was finally complete. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, interrupting the quiet afternoon. I picked it up, expecting a message from a colleague or perhaps a follow-up from the archive team. Instead, the screen displayed a simple email notification from Luis Ortega. My fingers lingered over the glass for a heartbeat before I opened the message. Luis had kept the email short and deeply personal. He wrote that his young daughter had recently been asking about the people who helped her father come home safely during the storm. He told me that he finally sat her down and explained everything. He explained who was on the radio that night, and he told her exactly who made the choice to keep him alive. Luis wrote, "My daughter asked who saved her dad. I told her your name." The final sentence was a simple thank you, signed with his full name. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, the setting sun casting long golden beams across the floorboards. I read the words once, twice, 3 times. The man who had been a name in an after-action report, a voice in a static-filled radio log, was now a father telling his daughter the truth. I looked back at the mahogany box on the dresser. The official military record had been corrected by federal authorities, and my name was finally restored to the files, but that document was just paper. The real record was the one living in the memory of a man who survived because I chose to act. I set the phone down and moved toward the living room window. I pushed the curtains back, allowing the last of the golden light to fill the space. For 12 years, I had walked through the world thinking I was defined by the shame my family forced upon me. I had carried the burden of their cowardice, shielding them while they slowly ground my reputation into the dirt. But I was never the failure they claimed I was. I was the person who stayed on the radio. I was the person who took the responsibility when the easy path was to look away. I turned around and scanned the room, noticing how every single piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, and every quiet corner of this home belonged to me. I had built this sanctuary without the permission or the approval of the Vance name. I had reached the pinnacle of my career through sheer discipline and objective results. A knock at the front door startled me, the sound echoing lightly through the apartment. I hesitated for a second, then walked over and turned the deadbolt. Standing on the landing was a courier, holding a small, unmarked box. He did not say a word, simply handed the package to me, and retreated toward the elevator. I brought the box inside and set it on the dining table. Inside, cushioned in protective foam, was a replacement set of official military insignia. It was the set I was meant to wear upon my promotion to lieutenant colonel, a set I had never bothered to order because the ceremony was supposed to be a private, quiet affair. My mother must have arranged for it to be sent. There was no card, no note, and no desperate apology attached. Just the physical object, reflecting the rank I had held for years but had never fully felt comfortable claiming in public. I lifted the small metal insignia out of the foam. It caught the evening light, shining with a clean, sharp brilliance. I walked over to my desk and placed it beside the mahogany box. I did not put them on. I did not need the metal to tell me who I was. The weight of the last 12 years had completely dissolved. I thought about Brandon, trapped in his own cowardice, and William, lost in the wreckage of a social hierarchy that no longer recognized him. They were still living in the shadow of their own lies, unable to escape the binary world where they had to be heroes at the cost of everyone else. I was living in the reality where human lives mattered more than official titles or clean records. That was the victory. I walked back to the window, watching the city lights begin to flicker on below. The Norfolk rain was a distant memory, replaced by the clear, cool air of a new season. My official record was corrected, the truth had done its necessary work, and the people who tried to bury me were the ones who had finally ended up in the ground of their own making. I stood there for a long time, listening to the city breathe, feeling the quiet, steady rhythm of my own life. I did not owe anyone anything. I was not a daughter of the Vance legacy, and I was not a failure of the Gray Harbor storm. I was a leader who knew the weight of a hard decision, and I was a woman who finally owned her own story. I reached out and clicked the light switch, plunging the apartment into a soft, comfortable darkness. Outside, the night sky was vast and open. I finally understood that I did not need to be validated by the past. I only needed to be present for the future. I closed my eyes, breathed in the cool, honest air, and for the first time in 12 years, I let myself fully rest. You have walked the long, exhausting road of holding your tongue while others built their pedestals on the foundation of your silence. And you now understand that your worth was never something that could be given or taken away by those who were too small to see your true strength. The story of Morgan Vance is not simply a drama about family betrayal or a career restored, but a lesson on the heavy, suffocating cost of playing the role others have scripted for you. You have likely spent years, perhaps even decades, sacrificing your own needs to preserve the comfort of those who would never do the same for you, believing that your resilience was a badge of honor to be worn in the face of their mistreatment. That resilience, when used to shield people who do not value your humanity, is not a virtue. It is a cage that keeps your own potential locked away in a dusty, forgotten attic. You must stop waiting for an apology from the people who hold the matches to the fire they set, because people who have built their entire identity on your diminishment are incapable of acknowledging the light you carry. True power does not come from waiting for the Admiral or the system to finally recognize your name on a document, though that justice is satisfying. It comes from the moment you decide that your internal truth is more valuable than their external validation. You need to understand that the people who demand you stay small are not your family, your peers, or your mentors. They are simply obstacles that your own fear has helped them anchor in place. When you choose to speak your truth, you do not need permission from the ones who have silenced you, and you certainly do not need to wait for them to understand their error before you begin living the life you have earned. Protecting a reputation that was built on theft, whether in your family or your workplace, is a tax you have been paying for far too long, and it is a debt that you are no longer obligated to service. You are the architect of your own story, and the most dangerous person in the room is not the one shouting the loudest or holding the highest title. It is the person who has finally stopped caring about being liked and started caring about being accurate. If you keep holding on to the ropes of a sinking ship just to ensure others don't get wet, you will only drown alongside them while the horizon remains wide and open for you. Have you ever felt that you were sacrificing your own integrity just to keep someone else's false narrative from falling apart? And what is one small, truth-filled step you could take today to finally set your own name free?